describe your parents and what they were like and how they got together and anything you can remember.
Well, my mother, her name was Ruth Habishaw White, and my father's name is Dale Eldridge White. And I don't know how they got together. But memories that I have of them growing up, early memories, is my dad always loved pigeons, and where we were first at, where I was first born, he had a pigeon coop, and I can remember him taking care of the pigeons as a little boy. And he loved pigeons. He also had a little garden next door at my Grandpa Habishaw's house, which was right next door, and he used to plant the garden and grow things in the garden. And I remember going through the garden and him planting the garden and the produce that we'd pick up from the garden. From Grandma, we lived right next to Grandma Habishaw, and so there was a pathway from our house. I guess I should look up, shouldn't I? To Grandma Habishaw's house. And I used to go back and forth there, and there was a ditch that ran through the property that was about 1.5 feet wide, and I used to like to float little boats and sticks and stuff down the river as a little boy, down the ditch, and watch them go down the ditch. The first memory I have of the home that we lived in as a little boy, where I was born, is we had a cold stove, and Mother used to cook with wood and coal and make the fire and cook on the cold stove. And I can remember that stove in the kitchen and her cooking in the kitchen. One experience that I can remember growing up is that across the street there was a family that lived there that had a billy goat out in their yard. And I remember playing over there one day, and the billy goat came up and hit me in the backside and knocked me over. And I can remember that experience. And I was probably about, I would say probably 3 or 4 years old. My mother was a very good cook, and she made especially good desserts. I think I grew up eating desserts every meal, especially in the evening. We always seemed to have desserts at evening time, some type of dessert, whether it was pudding or pies or cake or cookies. And one of the treats that we used to have on Sunday, which was a tradition, is Dad would make homemade ice cream. And we had one of the big 8-quart ice cream makers, and you would have to stand on the ice cream maker almost so it would move because it was so big. And we used to make ice cream, and I can remember doing that as a little boy. I had 3 sisters. I had Janine. She was 4 years older than I was, and Charlotte was 4 years younger than I was, and Debbie was 8 years younger than I was. And I was actually closest of those 3 sisters to Charlotte. When I was growing up, I loved sports, playing baseball and basketball, and I can especially remember Charlotte in our backyard being the catcher, and I was the pitcher, and I was throwing the ball, and she was catching it. And we lived next door to our bishop, and there was no fence between our house and their house, and I broke several windows in their house playing catch with Charlotte, and yet they never really got upset. And they were really good to me, even though I had a tendency to break their windows. And I 3 or 4 times I broke their basement windows with balls going off Charlotte or throwing it over her head and go next door. Dad was a drug salesman. He worked for Brunswick Drug Company, and so he was out selling all the time. And one time when I was about 5, he came home with a large supply of fly swatters, and he said I could sell them. I could go door to door selling them and sell them for a nickel. And as soon as my sister, older sister Janine, heard about that, she wanted to get in on the action, and so she wanted to go out selling them. So she went one direction and I went the other. And when we came back, she didn't sell very many, and I sold all the ones that I had, and she was upset. And they came to the conclusion that everybody felt sorry for me because I was so young. They bought a fly swatter for a nickel. I can remember going to first grade, and one experience that I had in first grade, which was a great embarrassment, was the fact that one day we were out playing at recess, and it snowed, and we were playing, and I got my pants really wet out playing in the schoolyard. And when I came back into the class, the teacher saw my wet pants, and she took me into the coat room and made me take my pants off and put my coat around me and spend the rest of the afternoon in school without my pants on and with my coat on. And I can remember how embarrassed I was and how upset I was. And then my aunt lived across the street from one of the school teachers that was teaching at the school, and I was one of her students. And she had mentioned to my aunt that I was very rowdy and disruptive in school, and she told my aunt that when Dennis grows up, he'll never amount to anything. And I can remember my mother hearing that, and when we moved out next to them, I can remember we were never too friendly to them, but we lived across the street from Fairmont Golf Course, and I can remember 3, 4, 5 years old sitting out on a swing on my grandmother's front porch, and we would watch the cars go by 9th East, and then we would watch the golfers over in the golf course. Let's stop for a minute. 8 years old, we moved from 9th East and Fairmont Park. We moved to our new house on 3019 Kenwood Street. It was in March when we moved in, and I was in the 3rd grade. And the place that we moved into, of course, was part of my grandfather's farm. And so we had over an acre of property. And my father went right away working on the property, and we had all kinds of, Dad always said that he would never plant any trees on the property except trees that would produce some kind of fruit. And so we had apple trees, we had peach trees, we had cherry trees, we had plum trees, we had apricot trees, we had pear trees. And so we had all the fruit trees on the property. And then Dad, of course, had a great big garden. And growing up in my early 8 to 12 years old, I was responsible for helping out in the garden, weeding and doing the irrigation. And I always remember that that was such hard work, and that I never would want to have a garden when I grew up. And that responsibility that they would give me was, I would always try to sneak away and play ball with my cousins or friends. And oftentimes I would sneak away and not do some of my chores. And I can remember that Dad would get upset when he came home. But then many times he would go out in the yard and work with me and teach me. And when I got a little older, my first job that I can remember working away from home was, let's go back. I want to tell a couple of stories. When I was 9 through 11, one of the jobs that I had was selling produce, and I had a wagon. And so when the cherries were ripe, I'd pick the cherries, put them in a crate on the wagon, and then go door to door with a scales in the truck to weigh the cherries, and go door to door selling cherries. And one day I was selling them, and I had several lugs of cherries on the wagon, and I went into one of the corner grocery stores on 27th South and Melbourne Street. And I went in there, and I think I went in to buy something, and the owner of the store came out and looked at one of my cases of that I had of cherries, and he said he would buy the whole case from me. And I can't remember what he paid me for it, but I was so excited because he bought the whole case. Another experience out selling produce is I would sell cherries, I'd sell apricots when they were ripe, and then when the tomatoes and cucumbers were ripe, I'd go door to door selling cucumbers and tomatoes. And I would have a little jar, a peanut butter jar, a glass jar, where I'd have the money when I collected the money from the customers. And I had it in the wagon. And one day some older boys came by, looked at what I had, and stole the money, picked up the money and stole the money and started running down the street. And it was right in front of our house that they did this, and I started yelling. And Dad came out of the house and started chasing them down the street. And I was, of course, standing there crying. And they were running so hard and so fast that finally they either dropped the glass jar or it broke from running and jiggling it. And all the money came out 3 or 4 houses down the street. And they got away, but we got most of the money. We went and picked up the money. But I can remember selling produce, and I enjoyed doing that, and that's how I'd make money for the summer. My first job away from home was working as a hod carrier for Bob Forsyth. Bob Forsyth, my brother-in-law, was a bricklayer, and he worked for a company. And so when I was in the 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, during the summers, I would work as a hod carrier. And the only reason I wanted to do that is because I wanted to get strong and do something heavy so I could build my muscles so I could play football and baseball and basketball. But I remember how hard a work it was, how mixing the cement for the bricks and lifting the bricks and setting up the scaffolding and taking care of the bricklayers. And I can remember going to work, would go early in the morning at 6 o'clock and then come home about 5 or 6 in the evening. And I did that throughout the summers. When I was in junior high, I had played Little League baseball and enjoyed playing baseball. And so I tried out for the junior high school team at Evergreen. And I was in the 8th grade, and I made the team as an 8th grader, and then I played as a 9th grader. I was a catcher, and I enjoyed playing baseball. We had our 9th grade team was the best junior high team in the area at the time, and we had a really good team. And I can remember playing baseball and basketball and in junior high school. When I was in the 9th grade at Evergreen Junior High, I was elected the 9th grade class president. And I can't remember of all the responsibilities I did, but I know at graduation time at the end of the year, I had to give a graduation talk at an assembly. and I can remember that I was petrified, and I was so nervous, and I just didn't want to do it. And Mom helped me write the talk, and I can remember giving the talk and how nervous I was and how scared I was. Then, moving into high school, I went to Olympus High School, and growing up, I had played a lot of ball with my cousins and friends. Also, Janine being 4 years older, a lot of the older neighborhood boys wanted to date Janine, and so they would always let me play with them. The older boys would let me play games with them, baseball or football, out in the street, because they wanted to date my sister. And so I always enjoyed playing with them, and I think that experience gave me more confidence when I got into high school. When I was in the 10th grade, I went out for the football team for the first year, and I can remember standing outside with all the other 10th graders that were trying out for the team. We were all standing out there, and the coach, one of the coaches, the head coach, was looking around, and he was asking all the kids what position they wanted to play. And when he got to me, I told him I wanted to play running back. And he says, "Well, you look more like a lineman." And I says, "No, I want to play running back." And he says, "Okay, we'll let you try out for running back." And so I tried out for running back, and I was one of the captains on the sophomore team. And I can remember I played both offense and defense, and scored a lot of touchdowns, and was one of the stars of the team, and enjoyed playing football, probably of all the sports, the very most. And then I played basketball and baseball on the high school team when I was a sophomore. And as a junior, I played baseball and football. And then as a senior, I played football and baseball. My junior year, I was looking forward to playing football. And the very first practice that we had, I had stepped in some type of a gopher hole or a hole out on the football field and twisted my ankle really bad. And I remember the pain of that and going through that, and I suffered through that the whole year. I really never got over it, and I played on the team, but I never played on the varsity team. I played on the JV team, and my season was kind of disappointing. But then when I started my senior year, I came out and was the first string running back. I was, not to brag, but I was the fastest kid on the team, and I was also very good at catching passes, and so they put me at running back and receiver, and I led the team that year in touchdowns, and loved playing football more than I did baseball or basketball. Okay, do we want to stop a minute? When I didn't make the JV team in basketball that year, I started playing ward ball, and we had a really good ward basketball team. We had a lot of kids on the team. We probably had 15 players in our ward. And we had one kid that should have really made the high school team. Well, he made it as a sophomore, but then quit as a junior because he didn't like the coach. And he was really a good outside shooter. And then we had a good center. And then I had my cousin Les, who played the guard line with me. And through my junior and senior year, we played numerous basketball games, because you'd play not only church ball once a week, but then you'd have the opportunity, when region started, they had region and all church basketball. And my senior year in high school, our basketball team had won the stake, and so we got to go to the region. We won the region, so we got to go to the area conference, we won the area conference, and then we got to go to all church. And in those days, they used to bring all the teams in from all over the United States to play basketball here in Salt Lake. And I can remember the first team that we played was from North Carolina, and by halftime they could barely run up and down the court. We were beating them so bad. But I think the altitude of Salt Lake and not being in condition, we just beat them, and I kind of at the end felt sorry for them. But then we got to the all-church finals, and we lost to a team from Davis for the championship of all church. But I can remember playing all those games and how much fun it was to play that much basketball in such a short period of time. And it was so much fun to play.
What about your uncle with the fight?
Oh, okay. The basketball games were always very competitive, and of course we have all the parents there in the gym, and Les's dad, my Uncle Steve, was highly competitive, and at one of the games, it was a close game that we had played, and the game had gone into overtime, and then we had lost in overtime by a few points. And we had paid referees at the time. And so after the game, we were sitting on the sidelines, and my Uncle Steve walked across the court, and one of the referees was sitting there on the bench by our team, and he put his hand on the referee's head and ruffled up his hair, and he said to the ref, "Step outside." And I can just remember how mad he was and how scared the referee was. But that's just one experience that we had playing basketball that was kind of funny as we look back on it. Let's see, let's talk about Mother. At Olympus High School, when I was a junior, starting the junior year, I had seminary and French class, and at the first of the year, there was a pretty young lady that was sitting next to me in seminary class. She was sitting right at my side in seminary, and her name was Sherry Andrus. And so I started to flirt with her and pass notes back and forth in class with her. And then I knew some of her girlfriends. And so in talking with them, I wanted to know what she thought of me. And so early in the school year, I found out that she did like me. And so I asked her out for the first date to go to the Olympus High Halloween dance. And I can remember taking her to that dance and how fun that was. And we started dating from that time when I was a junior in high school. Early in the year, we started going to all the dances together. And then during the basketball season, she was on the drill team for Olympus. And so I'd watch her do her performance at halftime of the basketball games, and then started taking her home after the basketball games and started dating her on the weekends. And so we started that relationship early my junior year, and then I dated her all through my senior year at high school too. And I can remember the first senior football game when I was a senior. We played Murray High School, and I had scored 3 touchdowns in the very first game. That was the first game of the year. I'd scored 3 touchdowns, and I can remember going over to Sherry's house, and I can't remember if I was going to pick her up or just going over to see her. And her dad met me at the door, And he looked me. He had known that I'd, of course, scored the touchdowns because Sherry had told him. And he says, "I just hope you don't get a big head from that." And I thought, oh, gee, that's a great way to meet your potential grandson. But I can remember him saying that and how upset I was at the time. After high school, I went into the Army, Army Reserve. It was the time when you either joined the Army Reserve or National Guard or had the potential of being drafted full-time into the Army because it was the Vietnam War. And so I had several of my cousins and good friends that we joined the Army Reserve, and we all went to Fort Ord, California, the 1st of July, right after my senior year of high school. We went to Fort Ord, California, and spent 6 months in basic training in Fort Ord. And when I was there, we had decided after we got through with the first 8 weeks of basic training, we wanted to have a car, and one of my cousins had his car here at home. And so it got to be October, November, and we decided that we would come home on a weekend leave and pick up his car and then drive that back so we'd have his car on the base so we could use his car to get around. And so we left on a Friday to come home, and we thumbed all the way to Salt Lake, the 6 of us out thumbing. And we got a ride from Fort Ord to San Francisco, and then from San Francisco we got a ride to Sparks, Nevada, just outside of Reno. And we split up in threes, and a guy had stopped to pick us up in Reno to give us a ride, and we got in the car, and I was sitting in the front seat, and my 2 cousins were sitting in the back seat, and the guy took off, and he was drunk, and he had a bottle that he was drinking as he was driving. And so we got way nervous, and he was swerving all over the road, and finally we tried to talk him into letting one of us drive, and he really got upset with that, and he reached over to his glove compartment and pulled out a pistol, and then we got really nervous, and finally we persuaded him to stop the car and let us out. And so he did that, and there we were in the middle of the Nevada desert, standing there, and he took off. And it wasn't long after that another car came by, and we were in our military outfits, so people driving by knew that we were in the Army, and a person picked us up and drove us all the way to Salt Lake. We were here for the weekend. We had to get back. We had to be back and report back to duty on Monday, so we only had 1 day in Salt Lake. And so we started back on Sunday, back to Fort Ord, California. And when we got to Reno, Nevada, going over the Teton, not the Teton Mountains, Donner's Pass, it was snowing way hard. And finally, it had snowed so hard that they stopped all the traffic, and they wouldn't let anybody go up and over the pass. And so for hours we were stuck in the car, and then finally late that evening they opened the road, and we got back Monday morning late, and so we were AWOL, and so we had to go before the captain of our regiment and report in and get our discipline for that. And the captain really liked us because he played with us on a flag football team for the base, and we played together, and he was part of the team, and so he kind of favored us because we all played on the flag football team together. And our discipline was just to clean one of the barracks that night, and that was the only thing that happened to us, which we got off way easy. But when I came home from my mission, Sherry had waited for me, and she was in college getting her education, and we dated. And then I had worked, and then decided that I wanted to go on a mission. And so I got my patriarchal blessing after I got back from the Army, and decided to put my papers in, and got a call to go to England, the Central British Mission. And I left in October of 1961, on my mission to England. At the time, the Mission Training Center was up at Salt Lake City, not down at BYU, and they had it up around the Deseret Gym. And at night, I can remember sneaking out of the mission home, and Sherry would drive up, and I would go out in the car and sit with her for a couple hours in the evening, when I should have been in the Mission Training Center. And she, while I was there several nights, she came up and to see me, and so several of the people, the elders up there, were doing that, and so I always thought that was kind of exciting. I left on my mission to England and served there for 2 years. My mission was a changing life experience in that I had never really given talks in church or studied the gospel. I'd read parts of the Book of Mormon growing up, especially when I was about 14. I knew the church was true all of my life. Growing up, I never questioned the church. I think I had what is sometimes known in the church as believing blood. I think I always believed the church. I never questioned the church. Growing up, my grandfather, who lived just a couple of doors down, always to me seemed to be a spiritual giant. When I would go over to visit him, he would be reading the Book of Mormon. He was active all his life in the church, and for some reason, I always looked to him growing up as being just a great example and a great spiritual example to me. And when I was younger, he used to come over to our house and have dinner. And at conference time, I can remember listening with him the conference talks. And he was then between 100 to 102, and so he had trouble hearing, and so they would put a transistor radio. They would put the little earphone in his ear and turn up the volume while we watched it on television so that he could hear the conference talk. And growing up, when I was back, I would say 12 to 14, I can remember sitting in the room with him and Mom and Dad and my sisters listening to conference, and I would look over at him and big alligator tears would be rolling down his cheeks. And I knew that he felt something, and I had felt something too, and I didn't know what it was, but later on realizing that it was the Spirit of the Lord. And so I grew up with a great admiration for him and a great admiration for the apostles and prophets of the church. And when I got on my mission, then I really grew in love with the scriptures, and especially what the brethren had to say. And at that time, we used to have several of the general authorities come to our mission as a missionary. We had several of the apostles visit. And later in my mission, we had President David O. McKay, the prophet, come to our mission. I was serving in a Welsh town down in southern Wales, and there was a new chapel being built in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, and that was the birthplace of President McKay's mother. And so he came over as the prophet to dedicate that chapel, and I was one of the missionaries that were transporting the general authorities in his group. I didn't actually have him in my car, but I had some of the other general authorities driving them to the Merthyr Tydfil chapel for him to dedicate the chapel. And I can remember him standing up in the chapel, and the first words out of his mouth were to the people there is, "I want you to know that my mother did not follow a false prophet." And that just, that message alone just centered right into my heart, and I felt that witness at the time, and it was a great spiritual experience of my mission, I think, to hear him say that. I was very successful as a missionary, and we had, I'd have to count again through my missionary records, but we had somewhere from 85 to 110 baptisms, and baptized a lot of families and had a lot of success. And it was a very spiritual experience. And the whole time I was there, of course, Sherry was writing letters every week, and we were corresponding back and forth, and she was finishing her schoolwork, and graduated before I got home from my mission, and started teaching elementary school when I got home.
Tell us about your mission companion, that one who walked the punt.
Oh, Aaron wants me to relate an experience that I had, and this was actually down in Wales. I had a missionary companion from Salt Lake City, and in fact, he was a tennis player, one of the best tennis players, I can't remember his name, in Salt Lake at the time. And we were out tracting one day, and door-to-door tracting, and we got to one door, and an older middle-aged lady opened the door, and to look at her, she was missing some teeth, and her hair was all not combed, and she looked terrible. And I remember him saying at the door approach, he said, "Lady," he says, "you look like you blocked a punt." And I started laughing so hard I had to walk away and get my composure. And we didn't get in the house naturally, but I thought that was a funny experience when he said that. The shooting?
No.
Oh, okay. Let me tell a couple of stories that happened growing up. One of the questions that Aaron asked me was, what was some of your embarrassing experiences? Probably the funniest thing and the most embarrassing thing that happened when I was at BYU is I needed to take one more credit of PE for my requirements for graduation. And the gymnastic coach for the BYU was living in our ward. And I talked to him, and he says, "Oh, just come and sign up for my trampoline class, and I think you'll enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, I'll let you just slip out, and you can go to the gym and play basketball for the hour." And I thought, gee, that's great. So I signed up for the trampoline class, and I remember going to the trampoline class, and I don't know if it was the first or second time, but I'd never jumped on a trampoline before. And I was on the trampoline, and I was jumping, and I finally got so I could go pretty high. And then I remember one time jumping high and coming down. Instead of coming down hitting on my feet, I came down head first and caught my nose in the netting of the trampoline and about ripped my nose off. It was all bloody and ripped up. And I remember that was the last day I got on a trampoline, and then the rest of the class time for that class I spent in the gym playing basketball. But that was probably the most embarrassing, because we had all the rest of the class members watching me jump on the trampoline when it happened. Growing up, I had two experiences with bees. The first one happened when I was probably 8 or 9. Dad had beehives out in the property, and one time I was out there and I lifted off the top of the beehive, and of course the bees started coming out and were swarming all over, and I started yelling and screaming. I started yelling and screaming, and Mother come running out of the house, and I don't know what she had in her hand, whether it was a towel or a rag or whatever, but she started swatting the bees all over me. They were all on me and all over, and swatting them and guiding me back into the house. And I can remember that neither one of us got stung that day, which was amazing, because the bees were all over. Then I can remember when I was 11 years old, being a Cub Scout. We had a hike that we were going to hike up and over Mill Creek Canyon, up and over the mountain down to the immigration side. And about halfway through the hike, I know there was probably 10 or 15 boys. We were hiking together, and I can't remember any leaders with us. I can remember a leader dropping us off, but I don't think the leader went with us on the hike. And we were about halfway up the mountain, and one of the kids ahead of me had stepped on a wild bee nest. And by the time I got there, the bees were going crazy. And I got stung. I remember on the lip several times, on the nose, on the eyelid. I got stung all over. And I can just remember crying, and because of the hot summer day, it was hot, the sweat going into my eyes, and I can remember crying and wondered if I'd ever make it home. And I remember my cousin Les coming up to me, and he says, "Come on," he said, "get over it." And he made me mad. And then finally we got down to the other side, the immigration side, and the immigration stream was running. It had a little water coming down, and I can remember getting some mud out of the stream and putting the mud on my face and wherever I got stung. And then when I got home, it was on a Saturday, I can remember walking around the backyard, and Mother and Dad were there, and I'm sure I looked, with all the mud and tears, and I remember them taking care of me. But that was an experience that I had hiking up and over Immigration Canyon. What was it? Oh, when
On the bus.
on the what?
On the bus, didn't she get mad?
Oh,
Her class.
oh, yeah.
Sunday school and your bus.
Okay, yeah. When I was, I must have been about 5 or 6. I'd go downtown with my mom on the bus, and we'd go downtown, and then she would do some shopping downtown, and then we'd come home. And one day we were coming home, and I was rambunctious on the bus, and the bus was crowded, and I kept jumping from seat to seat on the bus. And she kept saying, "Dennis, come sit next to me," and I was embarrassing her the way I was acting. And she was getting madder and madder as the time went on. I kept acting up. I didn't listen to her. And finally she said, "When we get home, I'm going to take a hanger to you." And I thought she was just kidding, and so I just kept going on. And as soon as we got off the bus and walked into the house, she came out with a hanger, and I got it. And that was the time I can really remember getting spanked. And that happened when I was like 5 or 6. I was way young. Then the other one was,
Sunday school or something.
Oh, when I was in Sunday school we were probably 12 to 14. We had a large Sunday school class, a lot of guys my age and girls, and I had several cousins in the class. And our Sunday school classroom was up on the second floor of the church, and there was a window there that we could open and climb out of the window and go on the roof. The church roof was a flat roof, and so we could go out on the roof of the church. And so what we'd do is we'd barricade the door before the teacher could come up with a chair so he couldn't get in. And then we would go out on the roof, and during the winter we'd get snowballs, and we were right on 20th East, and so there was a lot of traffic, and so we'd be up there pitching snowballs at the cars going by on 20th East. And one time we hit one of the cars really bad, and I remember him screeching his brakes and come running into the church. But I can remember that experience. I can't remember what happened after that, but we were terrible to our teacher, Sunday school teacher. And I can remember one time Mother was teaching the class, and we were so bad in the class and so rude in the class that she would come home crying. And my dad found out about it, and so the next Sunday, Dad was in the class with Mother. And I remember him being there, and no one acted up. We were scared to death with him being in the class, and so that solved the rowdiness problem of the Sunday school with him being in the class. My senior year of high school, it was late in the year, and we decided to go rabbit hunting to Snowville. My cousin Les was a big rabbit hunter, and I'd been a few times. We took 22s, and we decided that we'd take dates. And so each of us had a girlfriend, and it was probably, I remember it was probably March, April of the year that we went, when we were still in high school. And we drove up to Snowville, and I remember getting out of the car, and Sherry had never shot a gun before. I had a gun for her, and so I showed her how to shoot and how to handle the gun. And we were all, there was about 8 of us, and we were all in a long line walking through the fields. And there were rabbits going everywhere. We were shooting at rabbits, and Sherry hadn't shot. And I said to her, finally, I said, "Gee, Sherry, shoot at one of the rabbits. The next one you see, shoot at it." And so there was a rabbit that jumped up out in front of her, and the rabbit immediately, instead of going further away from us, cut up and went in between us. And as the rabbit went in between us, Sherry followed the rabbit with the gun and shot, missed the rabbit, and hit my cousin in the arm with a .22 bullet. And of course, immediately we had to leave and go to the hospital in Brigham City, and they looked at it, treated it briefly, and said, "You've got to get to Salt Lake." And so we immediately got home to Salt Lake. And I remember how embarrassed Sherry was. And when the news got around at school, they were calling her Annie Oakley. And so it was a really embarrassing time for her. When I was in school at BYU, and Mother had got a job down in teaching school down there just after we got married, and I decided that I wanted to try out for the BYU football team. And Hudspeth was the head coach at the time, and I can remember walking into his office asking him if I could try out for the team. And I had to go through his secretary, and finally I got into his office. And I can't remember all the conversation. It was very, very short. But I told him I wanted to try out for the team, and he looked at me. And of course, I wasn't in great shape, but I wasn't in bad shape. But I remember him saying that he wouldn't let me try out. And so I walked out of there and started crying, was devastated, because I wanted to try out for the team. And at the time, I was thinking possibility that my future, I'd like to be a football coach in high school. But that changed that experience. So.
Talk about your work.
Gee, we've been here an hour, Aaron.
Well, I know, but let's do both.
Okay. All right, graduating from college at BYU in 1967. I'd interviewed for jobs and was offered a job by the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. And they flew me back to Akron, Ohio for an interview and made an offer to me to go to work. And so I accepted that offer and went to work in Salt Lake City. I was in a training program with them for a year, training to be a store manager. And so I learned all the facets of tire sales and the tire business and management of a store. And then the following year, it was October 15th, Aaron's birthday. We were celebrating in our little basement apartment Aaron's birthday, and I had received a call from Firestone, and they wanted me to be in Twin Falls, Idaho the next morning to take over the store. They had fired the store manager, and they wanted me to be the new store manager, and that I had to be to the store the next morning. And so the next morning, I got up early at 4 o'clock and drove to Twin Falls, Idaho. That was the 16th of October. Sherry was pregnant with Matt and was due in a few weeks. And so I got up there and had the responsibility of learning how to run a store. And Mom came up that weekend. I can't remember. I came back home and got her, or how she got up there. Oh, I think she flew up there. I think that's how she got up there. And so we started looking for a house, and we finally got a duplex out in Kimberly, Idaho. And that was the third week or fourth week of October. And so here she was, getting ready to have Matt. Do we move or do we not move? And so we decided that we would move. She was really a brave gal to go, being that far into her pregnancy. And so we moved up there and got settled. And a week or so later, Matt was born. And so we spent a year and a half in Twin Falls, Idaho, running the store. And that was successful for me. And I got promoted to be a store supervisor. And the district manager at the time was named Kroonquist, and he was a great boss, and worked for him for several years, supervising stores in Utah, Idaho, and Montana. And then he finally left, and I had another boss. And then several years later, I got promoted, and we moved to Seattle, Washington. And I was over the wholesale business in Seattle. That lasted for about 6 months. And then that job ended. They decided to make some consolidations. So they put me back as a store supervisor, which I didn't really want to do because I had already had that position. But I took the position, and the stores that I was responsible for were not doing very well. But they turned around and started doing really well. And in a year's time, they were up at the top of all the stores in the country. And so they decided that I could be a district manager. And so they moved me back to Salt Lake City to take over the district. And I did that for several years. And then they decided that they would close the Salt Lake district and consolidate it with Denver. So I got demoted. And so finally, at that point of my career, I decided they had an opportunity to become part owner in the company stores. And so I bought a store at the Cottonwood Mall and the Fashion Place, not Fashion Place, but Valley Fair Mall. I had 2 stores and ran the 2 stores, and they were doing quite well. But right next to the stores, there were big Penny locations, and Firestone bought out the Penny's location. And so there were the 2 Penny's locations right next to my existing stores. And you couldn't run 2 stores that close together. And finally, the company decided to close the company stores, and I took over the big Penny's stores and was running the Penny's location. And then change of management, change of program, and finally I didn't like the way they were managing, and I didn't like the direction I was going. And so after 20 years with Firestone, I quit, and I quit in the spring. The boys had a lawnmower job, and I helped them for a few months doing the lawn job. And then at that point, I bought a small store down in Midvale called Bargain Tire and took that over after 20 years with Firestone.
What about, wasn't it?
Aaron wanted me to talk about some of the when I was a district manager, we had to go monthly to meetings, and we'd either go down to California, Los Angeles, or they would have them in Portland or Seattle. But most of the time it was Los Angeles. And in those days, a lot of the people smoked, and you'd go to those all-day meetings in a small hotel in a meeting room. There would probably be 20, 25 people in the room, and they would be smoking. And I just remember how terrible that was to be confined in the room, and then to have to come home. You'd have to hang your suit out on the clothesline to air out, but it was just a terrible thing to think that they could smoke full time in those meetings and fill up the room with all the smoke.
Didn't you have to share a room with people that smoked? Hotel rooms?
No,
Oh, I
no,
remember you
no.
said you can remember.
Well, why don't I talk about just family in general?
That's fine.
One of the great attributes that I saw in Sherry when I was dating her and we were going together was I realized that besides being in love with her, I realized that she would be just an excellent mother and would be a great mother to our children. And I could see that quality in her. And as we got married and had 5 boys, I've been able to see now, looking back over the last 50 years of our marriage together, that was really an insight that I had that was magnified in the sense that she met all those qualifications of being a great mother. She has been so good to our family and made so many great decisions that kept our family together. When we moved into our new home that we live in now, it was her that decided that we should have a sports court outside. That was her idea, and how much fun seeing our boys play on the sport court, and now seeing our grandchildren play on the sport court. She decided that she would have the family get together for dinner, and so we have them over every other Sunday for Sunday dinner, and that's been a tradition for a number of years that have brought our family together for Sunday. And of course, she was an excellent cook, and everyone loves to come for Sunday dinner, and how special that time is together. The other thing that she decided was, and we possibly decided this together, but we decided that we would try to find places to go on vacation with our family, to keep our family together as a family. And so we started out going to California. We started out renting beach houses in San Diego. We did that several times, and everyone in the family would come for a week and would spend a fun week in San Diego at the beach and enjoy that. And so then we decided one time to go to California and try to look for some type of a timeshare or a place to go that would be consistent and be available to us all the time. And so we went down to California, and we drove to Newport Beach, and it happened to be the time that Marriott was opening their villas at Newport Beach, and they had a great big tent set up out on the property with all the inside, with the salespeople and all the designs of the new building that they were going to build there at Newport Beach. And so we went into one of their presentations, and on the way home we decided that that would be a good investment to spend some money and buy 2 timeshares down there. And so we did that. And so we've been going down every year to California on the 4th of July. That was the week that we selected. And that has just been a wonderful experience for Sherry and I, and a wonderful experience for our sons and daughter-in-laws and the grandchildren. And they enjoy it so much, and we enjoy it so much. And I think it just gives you some insight on how important our family is. That probably growing the last 50 years of marriage with Sherry has been the top priority of her life and my life together, has been our family. We have a few outside interests that we like to do. I like to fish, and she likes to quilt. But our major priority and our major responsibility has been our family, and how much we enjoy our family and love our family and appreciate the blessings of the gospel that has brought us together and sealed us together in the temple as a family unit, and how much that has been a strength and blessing to us, and how much we want that to continue with all of our sons and daughter-in-laws and all of our grandchildren. That's it. That's enough. Aaron wanted me to bring up some of my church callings that I've served in the last 70 years of my life. And early in our marriage, I was, when we moved back to Salt Lake, I served in a bishopric for 5 years as a counselor. And then I served as a bishop of our home ward for 5 years, and got released from that calling and was called in to be a supervisor of a special needs program for 13 stakes here in Salt Lake, and I had that calling for 3 years. And from that calling, I got called in to be bishop of a young adult ward, and I was bishop there for a year and a half, and got called into the stake presidency of the Salt Lake Brighton Stake, with President Brewster being the president, and served in that position for 3 years. And since being released from those positions, the last 5 years I've been teaching the gospel doctrine class. And so I've had lots of opportunities and experiences in leadership positions. I remember how hard it was to go to the special needs program when I first got started, because we had 180 special needs young men and young women that had all kinds of special problems and special needs, and wondered why the Lord had called me to that position. But in serving in that position, I soon learned a great love for those individuals, and wondered often, in reflecting back on it, how those people could be so happy. Because when we would go to those meetings once a week and then on Sundays, most of those special needs kids were always happy. And I thought, gee, how could they be happy in the condition that they are in? And many times I reflected on and asked myself the question, what would these individuals be like, and what would they look like after the resurrection and the atonement? And realizing that they were celestial beings, and realizing the possibility of being someday perfect. And yet they were special in the sense that they were happy the way they were. And it gave me a deeper and stronger testimony of the atonement, and greater affection and love for the Savior, to realize that how special individuals are, and how special we all are in His eyes, and in the eyes of the atonement that He performed for us. I enjoyed bishop of the young adult ward very much. I loved working with the young adults. I loved interviewing them and being with them, and felt a great love for them and appreciation for them. I also love my callings now, teaching the gospel. I study and prepare for my lessons, and have learned so much about the gospel and the teachings of the gospel. But I'm grateful for these callings, and how they have blessed my life, and given me direction and help, and helped me solve personal problems as well as family problems, and realize that the great blessing and testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how true it is, how true the Book of Mormon is, and how grateful I am especially for the leadership of the church. I've always studied the lessons given by the general authorities, especially the prophet and the apostles, especially at conference time. I've read their talks, I've studied their talks, and realized the things that they have said over the years. I have tried to pattern my life in that direction, and what joy and happiness that's brought into my life, and how true I know that the church is and the gospel is, and want each of my sons and daughter-in-laws and grandchildren to know that I do have a deep and abiding testimony of the Book of Mormon, of Joseph Smith, of Latter-day Prophets and Apostles, and the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ, and realize it's true. And I've realized that, like I said at the beginning, I've had that belief, and I believe it is believing blood, and that is my desire for all of my family to know, and for each of them to join together, that none will be lost, that that we'll be together eternally as a family unit. And it's a great blessing, and it's a great blessing to be a grandfather. There you go.
All right.
So that you can hear what I'm saying now,
Yeah.
and we can hear you say the questions.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll edit that out.
Oh, you'll edit that out? Oh, okay.
So,
Well, edit this first part out.
what?
What I?
will.
Oh, okay.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.